Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So in today's video, I want to share with you how to stamp as well as some of the tips and techniques I use for getting consistent stamping on my projects. So let's get started. So let's talk about the types of stamps that are available to us to use. We have acetate stamps, rubber stamps, foam stamps, and really any sort of found object. In this case, I will be showing you how to stamp with bubble wrap today. So when you are looking at these stamps, they are all at different price points, and there's different reasons you'd want to use them on different projects. The nice thing about the acetate stamps is they're usually a little less expensive than the rubber stamps. They are clear, which is kind of nice. The only thing about them is they're not nearly as durable, even though these ones of mine I've had for more than 5 years. They're not quite as durable, and you don't have quite the level of detail as you have in a rubber stamp. So where I can, I usually try to buy rubber stamps. The one thing is rubber stamps are usually more expensive. So it's one of those trade-offs of a lot of designs are only available in acetate stamps because they're considered short run. They are not necessarily using rubber stamps. It also depends on the artist whether or not they choose rubber stamps or acetate stamps. And then foam stamps, these are the art foamy stamps. And I haven't used these a ton, but I do have some in my collection. And they just have a completely different look and feel to them than the other two types of stamps. So let's talk about how we can stamp these images. One way you can do it is using one that's already been mounted to a wooden block. These ones are easily available. You basically just grab them, add ink to them, and you stamp with them. But they are a little bit hard to store because of how thick they are. Another option is you buy sets of stamps, like this Tim Holtz collection set of stamps that I have, and they are basically similar to these ones, just without the block. And then what you do is you have a variety of stamping blocks available on the market. You just add them to them, they stick to them, you stamp with them, you clean them, you put them away. So the nice thing about this is that because you can basically mount it to your blocks, you're not paying the extra money for a block. You have all your images here, and these can be put into binders or stored in a more efficient manner. So most of my stamps are this type. I do actually have a couple boxes full of these types of stamps that I've picked up over the years. But I generally try to stick with these types just because it is a little bit easier, especially from a storage and price perspective. So I'm going to start by just showing you how to quickly stamp an image. And so I'm just going to use this butterfly because it's already on my stamping block. I'm just grabbing a piece of 110-pound Staples cardstock. I buy this in large sheafs and it works really well for me. I could go into an entire video just on paper. And if you are interested in hearing what papers I use for what purposes, please let me know. I'd be more than happy to talk about all the different papers that I use in my creative practice. But really, when it comes to stamping, you just want something that's fairly smooth, fairly flat, and that's really the easiest type of surface you're going to use at the beginning for stamping. For me, I stamp on top of paint. I stamp in my art journals on top of all sorts of different uneven surfaces. But if you're a beginner, I would not suggest you start there. You may not be happy with the results you get. So to actually stamp, I'm just going to be using some archival ink. This is an oil-based ink that is fairly waterproof. So it's nice because then you can add watercolor and other things on top of it and it won't bleed. You basically want to make sure that when you are inking, you want to actually put your stamp down and ink like this on top. You will actually get a much more crisp image than doing it the other way. The other thing is if you do it this way, you don't know for sure if you are perfectly covering the whole surface. This way you always know. And then basically you just want to go and just press down with a little pressure and lift. Simple as that. It's not hard to stamp. The question comes down to when you start getting into different sizes of stamps and different uses for stamps, this is where it can get a little bit more complex. When it comes down to inks to use, I'm not going to go into all the inks today. If you are interested, I would love to do an ink video for you guys. Just let me know in the comments that that's something you're interested in, and I will put something together. But in today's video, I'm going to basically just be using archival jet black ink. This one is oil-based and is waterproof, which is a really great choice for me. There's also the Distress Oxide Mermaid Lagoon. This is again another good dye-based ink. This one is water reactive though, so it again has a different use. And there's also pigment ink. These are the three I usually use when stamping, but again, if you are interested in seeing a video on inks, I'll go a lot more into why I use things, my application, and also a little bit more about the properties of these inks. So yeah, again, let me know in the comments if you're interested, and I'll put something together soon. So we've talked about just a basic stamping technique. So paper, add to a block, add your ink, press it down, we're good to go. But it's one of those things of that's just the tip of the iceberg, because then we start running into, well, what if you want to layer stamps? What if you want to do repetitive patterns? How do you get some of these techniques to be done really successfully? So I'm going to show you how to use a stamping platform. So here is the stamping platform that I will be using today. It's a MISTI stamping platform. It's 12 inches by 12 inches, which is why I'm having a hard time getting the whole thing in the camera. But I'll just show you in this corner here so that we won't have any issues. But basically, a stamping platform is a surface with a rule and a hinge. And with this hinge, this allows you to actually put your stamps on this part of the surface and press down onto your page. So you put your piece of paper here. I usually put a few magnets just to hold in place. And then the idea is that you would take your image, and because this has a grid, the nice thing is you're able to line it up quite easily. So I'm going to line it up so it's nice and square. And then stamp on my image. And if I look at this and I go, well, that isn't really what I'm looking for, that doesn't quite work for me the way it is, what you can do is you can either put it down on your surface and go, well, I actually want this butterfly to be at this angle here. Press down, it will actually stick. So then what you'll need to do is add your ink. In this case, I'm going to go back and use a little bit more of the archival ink. I like black and white images a lot and then coloring on top of them. So you'll see I'll end up usually using the archival ink preferentially to the other inks. You just add your ink on, press down, and lift. And so you end up with a really clear image. But the nice thing about this is if you ever don't end up with a clear image, the beauty is that you can actually stamp it over and over again. You can keep re-inking your stamp, and then you can stamp it over and over again until you actually get the intensity of color you want. So this really helps eliminate those stamping mistakes where maybe you didn't get quite even. The nice thing is you don't have to worry about it, because thankfully, with the way the MISTI is created, you can continue to apply your ink, and because it's on the actual hinge, it doesn't move. So you'll be able to get those crisp images that you're looking for. So you might be wondering why you would want to get a MISTI, well, if you're generally fairly good at stamping already. And for years, I never had a stamping platform until I started learning how to use other types of stamps. So these are Altenew stamps, and what they're meant to be is a layered stamp. So you have the solid part, and you have the different colors that go within those solid parts. And so this way you can layer the stamps on top of each other, but this is where a stamping platform really comes in handy. Because in this case, what I will do is I'm going to stamp the outer solid image first. So I'm just going to place it down on my surface. And I'm just going to take a minute and ink it. And I'm actually going to use a very light color of ink. I'm actually using this pigment ink Sea Glass. So you just want to make sure that you ink your stamp. And then I'm going to stamp it on my surface. And even though that did lift, the nice thing is because it is in the corner, I can put it back in the corner and stamp it again. Because I didn't quite get the level of image that I'm looking for there. So sorry, I'm off camera a little bit here, but basically I'm re-inking that stamp, putting it down again. And these ones are sticking a little bit, and that's fine because again, we have that corner so we can put it back in place and continue to add a layer. So now this is where things get kind of interesting. I'm just going to pull this out so I can show you how I am placing my next stamp. So now, because I have my first image, now I want to add my second layer on top. And so now what you need to do is actually try to line this up as closely as you can to the first image so it falls in between. And using a light color like this does make it a little bit more challenging. This takes a little bit of fussing. I don't think it has to be perfect, but it's one of those things to aspire to as you're learning to use these stamps, to understand how to make them look the best together. And so in this case, I'm just going to stamp in the center because it's a little bit easier for you to see. And so I'm just inking on the off screen here the surface of the stamp. And just so you know, you can get Misties on stamping platforms in much smaller sizes. I intended to use it with the scrapbooking pages, which is why I ended up getting a 12 by 12, but I would not necessarily suggest it unless you're using it specifically for doing backgrounds on scrapbooking pages. So I'm going to come down, add my image, you press it a little bit just to make sure it's down really well. And there you can see I haven't lined it up perfectly, but you can see the concept, right? Is that you basically start with your outer layer, you line up your stamp to do your next layer, and then you basically remove that stamp and then add your next layer on top of that. And so this would be extremely hard to do without a stamping platform. So this is where I could go in for the next color. And again, this is a little bit hard as well. So I apologize if my head's in the screen. I'm just going to lean over to try to line this up a bit better. All right, so now that I have that lined up, I'm going to again push it into here. And I'm going to use a deeper color. And this one's a little bit different than the other two colors, but I'm still going to use it because I think it's going to give a lot of contrast. So as you can see, even though I misstamped the second layer, that by doing these layered stamps, you can get some really complex shading on your stamped images with not a lot of effort. But again, a stamping platform is much easier to do this with. I tried these at one point without a stamping platform. They don't really work. So it's really important to have the right tool to make something like this really successful. So I also wanted to go over a couple other things when it comes down to stamping. So with this particular stamp, this is part of Tim Holtz's Glorious Gathering stamp set. It's a beautiful stamp. It has a huge amount of detail and it's gorgeous, but it isn't the easiest one to stamp. So I'll show you what happens when you're using a detailed stamp like this that is quite large and what can happen if you don't necessarily have the correct pressure. So I'm just going to ink the stamp. Again, this is one of the ones you do want to do it this way just so that you can see that you have ink over the entire stamp. So one thing to think about when you are stamping is that you need to be really aware of the pressure and the size of the stamp because the stamp is quite large. So if I just put it down and did something like this, it turned out okay, but you can see areas along the edge didn't stamp as well. I missed out on a few things here and there just because of the size of the image. So you have a couple options. You either use a stamping platform, but if you don't have a stamping platform, and especially if you're working on a different surface, because I actually have used this one a lot on an alcohol ink surface, and my archival jet black ink does work on an alcohol ink surface, but you have to be very aware that you're going to have a hard time getting the image to go down perfectly because of the surface. So as much as people say don't do CPR on your stamp, in my case, with these ones, I often will go along the edges and press down really quite well along all the edges just to make sure I got the entire image. You want to be careful with this because if you slide the stamp, you're going to get a blurry image. At the same time, you're probably going to get a little less clear image than you are by just that really light stamp. But the problem is if you end up with a not good image, you're not going to get any further ahead than you want. So as you can see, I didn't lift that very well. That's why we have a little bit of edges there. But you get the concept that basically the idea is that you want to make sure you get all of the imagery in, which means that when you're dealing with large stamps or background stamps, or you're stamping on different surfaces that are maybe less smooth, you may need to put a little bit of extra pressure and play with it a bit just to get a really good stamping. So what if you're like me who likes to do a lot of mixed media work? I stamp on decoupage, I stamp on acrylic paint, I stamp on uneven surfaces that are not conducive to getting really good stamped images. One thing is you just need to be okay with not necessarily always getting a perfect image, but let's say you do want to try to get as close to the image as possible. Sometimes what I end up doing is actually taking the stamp off of the block, and I'll stamp a section of it, and I will actually just use my fingers and just get it in there. It might not be the perfect way of doing this. Is again, you're going to have a little bit more of an uneven stamp, but let's say you have all these little crevices, then this way you, by running your fingers through places, you're going to actually have those bumpy surfaces. The stamp will meld to them and give you a much clearer image. So again, you'll notice that it's not as clear as I use the stamping platform, just because I was squishing it and playing with it. But if you're trying to get a good image on an uneven surface, this is a good way of doing it. And since we're talking about troubleshooting and different ways you can stamp, the other thing I would like to talk about are stamps with larger black areas like this. And this is something that I've had to learn how to work with, because if you actually just stamp this and throw it onto your paper, you'll notice something kind of interesting ends up happening. So when we stamp this image, you'll notice that in these black areas, it is not consistently black. And part of that has actually nothing to do with the quality of the stamp. It has to do with surface tension. These areas are so large, and because of the way the ink reacts on the page, you're going to have a very hard time getting a perfectly black area there. One thing you can do is use a stamping platform. Often when I do these trees, I will specifically use a stamping platform and just stamp a few times, and then it'll get darker and darker, and eventually it's going to look really consistent. The other option is sometimes I will go in with a pen that's the same color and just color in. But it's just something to realize that anything with really large areas of black like this, you're going to have a little bit more trouble getting a really consistent, clean, perfectly even stamp out of. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how to stamp with found objects. In this case, I'm going to show you how you can just use Distress Oxide ink on some bubble wrap and just stamp bubble wrap onto your piece of paper. You can see it works pretty well. So then again, this is where you can add a few more layers. This is where you could grab some of your wilted violet. And again, this is just bubble wrap that I got with a package. It's nothing special. It isn't. There's nothing special about it except that I pulled it out of a box. And then you can see that just by doing this, by adding a few layers, maybe let's just add a little bit of evergreen bough before we finish this up. You can end up with something that's kind of fun and a great background that could be used on a variety of projects. And so there's all sorts of things around your house that you can stamp with. I know people who have used celery, the balm of celery. If you just cut it off, you can use that to make a flower. You can use toilet paper rolls. You can make cardboard shaped into different shapes to be able to come up with different ways of doing it. I actually have a section of cardboard that I use for making lines on my mixed media projects. So there's lots of different ways you can do it. But the reason I want to bring this up is often when you're using these found objects or whatever, ink is great, but I find paint even better. And that was one thing I want to talk about today, is how to use paint with your stamps. And I used to struggle with using paint with my stamps, because what I would do is I would take my brayer and some paint, and I would just put paint straight on the stamp. What I've realized about that is you can gunk up your stamps. It can be hard to make them clean. My favorite use is actually using a jelly plate. If you do not have a jelly plate, just use whatever kind of non-stick surface you have, like a silicone mat, a piece of parchment paper, a palette if you have it, like anything that is smooth and will not absorb the paint. And so in this case, I have these Paper Artsy paints that I'm going to show you today. I picked these up the other day. They're a new brand for me. But by adding a little bit of paint to your jelly plate, you can basically just take your brayer and put out your paint across your surface. And I'm actually going to mix this with a little bit of yellow. And if you've never actually done jelly printing or anything, please check out my video on jelly printing. I know that I've had a lot of positive comments. People have really enjoyed it. And I do kind of walk you through some of the basics of jelly printing and ways you can use it in your projects. So now if we take this and we lay it down, and we've picked up a bunch of paint and we actually throw it on top of our piece of paper here, now you get something very cool. And so you just need to set this aside to dry. But again, I like the vibrancy of it. And it's a great way of stamping with your found objects or even with your stamps. The one thing about stamping with paint that you need to be aware of is do not leave it on your stamps for any period of time. Really, even for this video, between each stamp, I am going to basically go wash my stamp pad from the paint just so that I don't end up ruining my stamps. So when it comes down to just a regular stamp, this is one of the ones where you don't do it the same way as you would do with an ink pad where you would add the ink on top. In this case, you stamp in and you stamp on your surface. That was my fault. I didn't actually make sure my stamp was in place properly. Stamp in. That one I stamped a bit too hard into the surface there. Stamp in again. And this is where you can end up getting some really cool results with your stamping. And again, this is where you could go crazy and just add a whole bunch of just stamped images and just make it a very fun textured, fun textured background. And then what's cool about this is, so now that you actually have paint on your jelly plate and you don't want it to dry on your jelly plate, so you basically go like this, put a piece of paper on top, rub it, take a print, and some of the paint has come up. In this case, it's already drying pretty quickly, so I need to actually get this to the sink and make sure that it doesn't stay this way. Or you can also use some alcohol. Actually, I think I'll do that right now because I still want to show you a few more things. Is you just add alcohol. So I'm running out of alcohol. Or rubbing hand sanitizer, sorry. You add some hand sanitizer straight to your plate like that. And then by cleaning it up, you want to make sure you get stuff along the edges too. You can clean up that jelly plate, and that way you don't wreck it, but at the same time, then you can keep working. This paint dries a little bit faster than some of the paints I've been using before. So there you can see that now that we've done it this way, what we could actually do is come back in with your archival black ink. Stamp a couple butterflies on top. Put a little saying there, and now you have a card, right? So it's one of those things where, again, by using stamping techniques and by using paint and other mediums with your inks, you can end up getting a lot of variation in color and texture. I'm going to show you another print. This one I'm actually going to move to the Pebeo because I think I've realized I really like this paper artsy paint. It doesn't have the same extenders in it like that the Pebeo does, and the Pebeo will allow you to have a little bit more working time. When I've gone to the art store, they have always suggested this one, and when I've been in art classes, this is the one they've always suggested for using for jelly printing because it has that little bit of extra time. So I'm just going to do some purple and metallic together. And what I wanted to show you is how we can use this. That's a lot of paint, actually. I put a lot of paint on the surface, but that's okay. I can create some jelly prints. We can do some fun stuff with it. You don't have to always wash it off. There's lots of options for making sure that you end up using this paint as far as it can go. So when you're stamping with the foam stamps, you want to make sure that you press down nice and evenly to get your paint on there. And press nice and evenly on your surface to transfer. I don't use foam stamps a lot, but I think they definitely have their place. I know people who rave about them. I haven't figured out how to use them well enough that they are part of my creative practice. But this is something I'll continue to work on. I just wanted to show you them as a concept and as a possibility when using them in your creative practice. And actually another thing you can do with them is if you still have a little bit of paint on your surface, you can always do that second print. And I do this a lot in all of my stamping. I will do the first print and then sometimes I will do a follow-up print. So for example, this butterfly here, I can do a first print, a second, a third, a fourth. And so depending on what you want to do with it, what you could do is actually stamp your, if you wanted all of them of this color, is that you have another piece of paper that you're stamping off all your other gradations on, so you end up with this very light image. And this works with any sort of ink pad, any sort of color. So again, if you want those changing color values and a lot more variety in your stamping, this is not a bad way of going about it. So the last thing I would like to talk about today is cleaning your stamps. If you're using any sort of paint, make sure that you're using hand sanitizer or alcohol to clean them if it does not come clean with water. You want to make sure as soon as you stamp, you clean them right away. For a lot of these stamps, I will just use a baby wipe just to get rid of most of the color off of them. But after a while, I find that my stamps will start getting a little grungy. They'll get a little bit sticky and they won't necessarily stamp as well as they could. So in that case, what I do is I take this all-purpose stamp cleaner. This is a StazOn brand one that I've had for years. I got it specifically because I do use StazOn solvent ink on some of my projects, and that one you definitely want to be able to use a stamp cleaner like this for, just to not damage your stamps. But in the case of this particular cleaner, it works on everything. So you can see I've already removed most of the ink with a baby wipe, but there's still some of it sitting in those crevices. So by basically adding this on top, it just pulls off all of those little impurities. And because this one's meant for solvent ink, it's a little bit stronger. So it'll pull off all the different inks that you have on those surfaces. And this one will be actually really simple just because it's more of a flat stamp. And these ones are generally a little bit more easier to clean. So once you've just added your stamp cleaner, you just want to take a piece of paper towel. In this case, I like using shop towels in my art space just because they last a lot longer than regular paper towels. And you just clean them on up. I would say that generally I don't go crazy cleaning my stamps. By nature, I love things that are clean and tidy. I try to get them clean enough where if I need to stamp white, it's not going to discolor the white. That's my concern. So most of the time I just use baby wipes. But again, if you ever need to do a deep clean, using an all-purpose stamp cleaner does help. So here are the samples from the demonstration today. Again, with the inks and the paint, you can do a lot in your stamping to end up with really consistent results. And I hope you've learned something new. If you have, if you could please comment below, I would love to see your questions and your comments and be able to reply to them. You can also see a lot of other creative content on my website, hopalongstudio.com. I also am doing a scrapbooking layout tutorial tomorrow for National Scrapbooking Day. I would love for you to check it out. If you want to make sure you don't miss out on that video, hit the notification button and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on any future videos. I hope you have a really great week, and I will see you next time.